Okay, so why don't we go ahead and get started? It's about 4 minutes after the hour, so hopefully folks have had a chance to get their computers configured and get everything working. I see that we have a good number of folks with us, and we're delighted you all could join us. My name is Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation. We're a 33-year-old free market think tank based in Dallas. I'd like to welcome you all to our Zoom policy briefing today. We've done a number of these over the past couple of months. And while it's not as good as seeing people in person, it is at least an adequate substitute. I would also like to thank our friends at the World Affairs Council of Dallas-Fort Worth for also co-sponsoring today's briefing. Our briefing today is with a longtime friend of IPI's, Amity Shlaes. We're delighted that Amity could be with us today to give us a historian's perspective on our current situation, including the economic crisis caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, but also her perspective on some of the current civil disruptions that we're having as a result of what appears to be a pretty serious abusive situation at the hands of police. Some of Amity's research into the Great Society is relevant to that as well. So it's actually very timely that we have Amity with us today. Let me do a little Zoom housekeeping first. For those of you who are not yet burned out completely on Zoom, you can turn your video off or on as you like. So as I mentioned earlier, we're happy to see your smiling faces in your dining rooms and your spare bedrooms. But if you don't want us to be able to see you, you have the option of turning off your video if you choose. Everyone's microphones are muted by default when you enter the room. And I'll be selectively unmuting microphones when we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion. Down at the bottom of your Zoom window, you have the ability to raise your hand. That's a Zoom function. And that's what you should do if you have a question that you would like to ask. And if you raise your hand, you'll show up in a queue on my screen, and we'll try to recognize as many questions as we can when we get to the question portion of the program. And now let's get on to our program. As I said, we're delighted to have our longtime friend Amity Shlaes with us today. Amity is the chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation, as well as the author of 5 books, including 3 New York Times bestsellers. Among those are her wonderful book on taxes, The Greedy Hand, How Taxes Drive Americans Crazy and What to Do About It. Probably her best known book is The Forgotten Man, A New History of the Great Depression, which also exists in graphic format, which is really fascinating just from a publishing experimental standpoint. And it's great fun to read the graphic version if you've not done that already. She's the author of a biography called Coolidge, and became such an expert on President Calvin Coolidge that, as I mentioned, she became the chair of the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. And then Amity's most recent book is The Great Society, A New History, a look back at Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program. And that's the only one of these that I've not yet read, Amity. So that's next on my project. In fact, last night I got the Kindle version of it. So I plan to dive into that as soon as I possibly can. Some years ago, more than either Amity or I would care to recall, we had Amity to Dallas to speak at a luncheon when she came out with The Greedy Hand. And we'd love to get her back to Dallas sometime in the near future. But for now, Zoom will have to do. So Amity, we are seeing unemployment numbers that parallel those of the Great Depression. And it's quite a shock to many of us who were enjoying a relatively robust economy, and to suddenly be seeing numbers and charts that have as their antecedent the Great Depression. You know, we've talked internally here at IPI about how, you know, for the rest of our lifetime, people will look at some of these economic charts and they'll say, what on earth was that spike? Or what on earth caused that huge dip and drop? And it's going to make for some interesting charts in future years. Of course, the cause of all of this is very different than the cause of the Great Depression. But a lot of us are wondering right now, how quickly will the economy be able to get back on track? Are the actions that the federal government has taken, are they helpful? Are they harmful? Are they adequate? And of course, your research and writing on the Great Depression is very relevant here. is particularly your insights that government actions tended to extend the Great Depression rather than hasten economic recovery. So we're all eager to hear your perspective on that and other things that we're facing right now currently, what the federal government should be doing, the great dangers of the wrong things that the federal government might do, and make things even worse. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn things over to our dear friend, Amity Shlaes.
Thank you, Tom. I'm very grateful to Tom and to IPI for several visits. And also, I will say to the Bush Library and President Bush 43 for some time I spent in Dallas working on high school economic debate and other economic projects with the Presidential Center and Library. I'm very happy to talk to Texas. It's an important place for me, but also would like to welcome all non-Texans who are appearing on this show. So it'll be great. We're looking at the numbers and we're explaining them to our children, ourselves, our grandchildren, and unemployment is well over 10%. That is a very high number. Anything over 10%, particularly well over 10%, recalls the 1930s and the Great Depression. That is, as most of you know, but I'll remind just in case, that is the point when we had double-digit unemployment for a decade. There were a few blips of non-10%, but just about rest of the time, it was 10%. That double-digit unemployment for a decade was what put the great in the phrase Great Depression. No question about it. But of course, in the same period, we saw the market go down. The peak of the Dow in 1929 was 381, which was real high for the period. It had been 200 or 100 just a few years before. So the market crashed, as you know, in 1929. What's remarkable is that the market did not come back to that high until well after World War II. So the younger people on the show today, I think most of us think an ever-rising Dow is now our birthright. That was not the case, say, for people born in 1920. They had to wait till they were way adults to see the Dow come back to the 29 level. That was quite disconcerting to see the Dow down that long. So however you write it, the Great Depression was great. But sticking to the unemployment, as Tom hinted, these are data points, and a few data points do not a Great Depression make, even if they are Great Depression level data points. There were many other points in American history we know now by going back and doing some math retroactively maybe, and often sometimes running regressions, that there were a number of points in American history when unemployment was over 10%. It's important to understand one would be in the early 20s, for example. That's the forgotten depression, which F. Scott Fitzgerald described in The Great Gatsby. We think of The Great Gatsby as describing the 1929 crash. The Great Gatsby was, however, published in 1925. Tell every high schooler that. So it was describing the downturn in the early 20s. The unemployment then was terrible. It was just brief and probably not publicly known. That's the second point that's important to note. A number only matters when it's well known and publicized and carefully publicly quantified. We wouldn't care so much about unemployment if we didn't have the ritual of the Labor Department or the BLS quantifying with great fanfare, say on Friday mornings. Until recently, the government didn't quantify unemployment every week, month. It didn't even quantify unemployment as Roosevelt came into office. So those previous 20% unemployments, which we're pretty sure existed by using other math or by going to look at state data, aren't well known, which makes the Great Depression better known, and it makes it seem rarer. You can find 3 or 4 points when unemployment was pretty likely 20% in the United States. We just don't know about it because it was never officially quantified in that way, and because it wasn't in the interest necessarily of the history book writers to publicize the data retroactively. So think about that. When you give someone a number, you give them an argument. what was it about the Great Depression that made the Great Depression great? I tend to anthropomorphize. Recoveries are like people, they make choices. And from 1929 to 1940, every year, the recovery took a look at the United States and decided to stay away. All things being equal, the recovery wants to come back. America wants to grow. The recoveries do make choices. And the recovery said, not this year, I'll sit it out. Why was that? Usually for a different reason every year. Always, though, bad policies. So we've had some debates. Tom and I have even had some debates, and I think with Dr. Savings, for example, about the monetary issues in the early 30s. Some of us call it deflation. Some of us call it a credit crunch. Some of us have other terms to describe what happened in the early 30s. You can be in the Kindleberger school, or you can be in the Barry Eichengreen school, or you can be in the Milton Friedman school, or you can be in the Austrian school, and have a different explanation for why things were bad then and people had to print their own money. There was a printing of money, making up of sort of script, including in Texas. Anyway, something was wrong with the money in the banks. There's a lot of general consensus on that. But you cannot explain the Great Depression by monetary. You can explain the first part of it by monetary and banking. I would argue, say 32 to 40, other factors mattered more, though monetary always played a role. I do think, I will emphasize, I think the monetary fight is divisive and obscures from us the real problem. Other causes of the duration of the Great Depression, of the duration of that unemployment that made the Great Depression great. One was labor price. We were never allowed to argue that in school, but truly the labor price in this period, the cost of employing someone was too high. So what will an employer do when he's in a crunch and he doesn't get payroll protection money necessarily, or he gets the wrong kind of payroll protection or forgivable loan, to use the current vocabulary? Well, a sensible employer who's short profits, who's short revenues, who's having lower sales will reduce wages, right? Because we all like the people we work with, and turnover is very expensive, and retraining people is very expensive, and we don't want to cause heartache. That was the tradition in the United States up until 1929. That is what happened in recessions. Employers went to employees, and many of you are employers, and said, gee, this year I can't pay you quite as much or give you the raise, or I'm going to furlough you for a time and hopefully you'll be back by Christmas. In the Great Depression, we had a different philosophy, and here the blame and responsibility starts with Herbert Hoover. So it was a bipartisan, different philosophy, which relates to what we would call Keynesianism today. We said, let's pay everyone as much as we can, because then that will stimulate demand. Then a new concept. It was sort of proto-Keynesian, because Keynes hadn't published all his great works by the early 30s. It was the mid 30s that he did. Let's pay really high, and let's force or pressure or use moral suasion upon business to make business pay higher wages than it otherwise might in this very difficult time. So Herbert Hoover exhorted business to pay high wages, even though business had less money coming in, and signed laws that put upward pressure on labor price, such as the Davis-Bacon Act, which you may have heard of and sounds obscure, but actually, of course, has an effect on government contractors, who, of course, were proliferating in the New Deal period when there was a lot of government work relative to the past. Then other laws from Franklin Roosevelt, who was the president from 1933, also put upward pressure on wages. You think, oh, Texas is a right to work state, whatever. In those days, all states were union states. That was before the Taft-Hartley law, which created the right to work option for states. So every state was a closed shop union state, and the president backed the unions, and the unions demanded very high wages. So companies were really under stress. They had to pay high wages, or they had violence, think of today, They had actions, they had the sit-down strike, and the administration, that would be the Roosevelt administration, was on the side of the unions. Clearly, the NLRB was a new and powerful thing. So if you look at a chart of the 1930s, what you see as an employer is that wages were unnaturally high for such a slow economy, tragically high, because that meant people couldn't be rehired. You think of the truisms, nice work if you can get it, or you think of what your grandparents said, particularly in the non-area, if you had a job, you were all right, or your parents. I heard that over and over again. It was all right in the Great Depression if you had a job. The trouble was getting a job. That phrase conveys what was real, which is the rigidity in the employment market due to the pressure for high wages. People didn't rehire easily. It way different from, it was a break in history. And if any of you are really interested in data on that, this is suddenly a controversial thing to say, though it's patently true. There are two economists I recommend. One is called Lee Ohanian at UCLA. Maybe he's spoken here. And another is Harold Cole. And they chart the whole century and show that the government basically, and the unions basically, insisted wages be high. And therefore, the unemployment in the 1930s was that much worse, that much more egregious. So I want to mention that. And, you know, a couple other factors, what made the Great Depression great, and we can go into all the detail. One was regulation. And when I say regulation, I really mean regulation. You're in Texas. One of the things I read, and that's in my new book, The Great Society book about Lyndon Johnson, was that there was a lot of crops plowing under in order to curtail supply, quirky economics, in order to drive up price. And that the mules of Texas refused to plow under or step on the crops like the mule drivers were hoping they would, because the mules have been trained to be very careful about the tender plants, right? Animals learn well, and they knew that they weren't supposed to step on those darn plants. And if you look up about Lyndon Johnson, you'll see as congressman or head of the National Youth Administration, he was involved in the curtailment of supply, perverse, in Texas, of course, at the behest of President Roosevelt and the AAA. Within the National Recovery Administration, which was the sort of industrial counterpart, right? The great authority that managed the US economy, if you can imagine, they actually had the chutzpah, to the hubris to try to manage the US economy in the name of recovery. There was just very heavy regulation written by suspect parties. So every interest group got in there and said, we're creating an institution to bring back recovery. And by the way, it's going to support our interest. What do I mean by that? The supermarkets got control of the poultry regulation, and they rigged the poultry regulation to favor the supermarkets, not the old-fashioned live poultry shops. So that, or the little shop where you used to buy your chicken, and that killed the little businesses. Just now, as you see Walmart winning, or or mail order winning relative to the specialty shop, because of the arbitrariness of the COVID culture. COVID culture, in fact, really does recall what it was like in the New Deal and the absurd arbitrariness of it. And this too, I will mention, ladies and gentlemen, is deeply controversial for me to say, even though they recognized that at the time and said so in the newspaper. Last summer, I wrote a piece about chicken regulation in the New Deal and how they ended, in the name of recovery, the decision was that customers could no longer pick their chicken. No consumer choice, because consumer choice slowed commerce, because the consumer took a long time picking his chicken. These would be live chickens, and that's just crazy. As we know today, customers relish choice. It's the basis of the business Starbucks, right? Whether you can have foam on your latte or not is your sovereign right, and that's what drives you into Starbucks. Anyway, they the New Deal laws regulated to the nth how businesses acted, often perversely, and made a lot of rules. And I argued about that, and I got attacked last summer by a Harvard professor, law school, named Mark Tushnet, who said this just wasn't true and that I should never say this, and how dare I say this, when the evidence, of course, is there right in the testimony of the court cases about the New Deal. so even as we've known one another, Tom, and this audience and I have known one another, saying the obvious factual story, repeating the facts that we knew has become more controversial, including in economics. The third factor that made the Great Depression great was the uncertainty of a large government. So, and COVID makes that all so much clearer again to us. You don't know what they're going to do. Are they going to want masks? Are they going to say masks are useless? Are they going to let us open? Are they not going to let us open? And of course, business will always freeze. It will freeze because when there's an elephant, like a big regulator for health or economics in the room, and that slowed recovery as well in tragic fashion. There was an economist I love very much, and I'll stop with this, and that Tom asked questions and you asked questions, named Benjamin Anderson. Anderson wasn't a marginal economist. He was the chief economist of Chase, the bank. And he wrote a wonderful line that applies today. He said, what caused the Great Depression and made it great? The government decided to play God. It was due to the government decision to play God, to assume it could do more than it could and demand of its people the authority to do that. And then even better, he said, when the government saw that playing God didn't yield the recovery that it had promised, it then did not cease to play God. Rather, the government resorted to playing God more vigorously. And that reminds us of 2008 and the multiple rescues, or the multiple rescues now vis-a-vis COVID. You know, when government fails, it doesn't give up playing God. It plays God more vigorously. I like that very much. I think I'm going to make a crossword puzzle out of it, or else at least a jigsaw. Play God, then play God more vigorously. And I'll say one thing, you know, my Great Society book is new. I'm very proud of it. It has facts many of you may know. There's a lot of Texas in it. But the story with the Great Society is the same. The government played God, it didn't get the result it sought, so it played God more vigorously. That was the Great Society.
Well, Amity, it's no surprise to me to learn that the mules in Texas were smarter than the policymakers in the federal government. That I'm not at all surprised by that, not one bit. And you know, so much of what you talk about reminds us of Hayek's knowledge problem, right? Which is, you know, government bureaucrats assuming somehow that they have big enough brains and that they have enough information to manage a system as complex as a national economy with, you know, today more than 300 million people acting in it. But, you know, back then, certainly, you know, a couple of 100 million people acting in the economy. And this is one of the things that I just love so much about your book about the Great Depression is it's almost, it would be funny if it weren't so sad, right? Some of the stories and some of the anecdotes about things government tried to do to tell virtually every sector of the economy how it ought to be operating. Bureaucrats showing up telling farmers how they should be plowing their fields. And, you know, in most cases, a bureaucrat who had never plowed a field in his life, but thought his brain was so big and his access to knowledge was so great that he knew better than the farmer what they should be doing.
Well, what's interesting today, I mean, think about COVID and the authority of government. First, government told us not to worry. Then government told us not to wear masks. Then government told us that ventilators were the only answer. Pretty soon, it was discovered that the mortality rate on ventilators was terrifying. And if you have any health condition, you've thought about that and whether you're going to let them put you on a ventilator and whether your spouse will be there to fight for you, probably not, because you have a contagious disease, right? And what are you going to do to resist that ventilator? Because X%, which is a very high one, die on those darn ventilators. But this has all been a learning curve. And clearly the government knew nothing at the beginning, the state governments, the hospitals, even the doctors, because this was a new disease. And yet the government, after so many errors, these governments still claims authority as if it had a perfect sterling record on this health crisis. So that was the New Deal. The record, every time something didn't quite work out or looked very embarrassing, the government would actually strengthen its authority and move on to the next project. And I hadn't really remembered it so well till this spring when we went through COVID, which reminded me.
You know, it's interesting to me. If they would simply acknowledge that they didn't know and that they didn't have the answer, I at least would have more respect. But there's somehow when you have a bureaucratic title with the government, you're not allowed to do that, right? You have to always be giving the impression that you have this huge amount of knowledge and that you're in charge. The mask thing drives me up the wall, but one of the original sins in the whole COVID-19 thing was the CDC botching the first round of tests, right? So we place this enormous amount of trust and reliance in our betters in the federal government. And in fact, it was they who dropped the ball at the very beginning, not the people. It was the specific government agency that was tasked with being able to manage that one bit of competency, and they weren't able to do it.
That's right. Hayek is, I'm the chairman of the Hayek Book Prize, and there should be 20 Hayek Book Prizes, because he explained, even though he himself was an academic, the fallacy of assuming that you can know everything. And because essentially those of us who are in business get feedback from the market all the time. If we have a retail product, we know in one day that the market likes or doesn't like it, and what the market does or doesn't like about that product. So overnight we can edit the product and come up with version 2 tomorrow. The government, Hayek was essentially saying, it doesn't get much feedback. It gets elections every 4 years for presidents, maybe 2 years for congressmen, 6 years for senators, and also it's insulated because many government politicians only listen to interest groups who, so they have a little bit, but they're basically insulated. It's like the government employees now who are going to be the last to be laid off, so don't understand the damage of the layoffs they are causing through shutdowns. So yeah, I do think Hayek is our philosopher. He's certainly the philosopher of the Great Society book too. In fact, he's a character in the Great Society book because he was here.
When you were talking about ventilators, and I'm thinking about the speed of government, right now there are bureaucrats right now still issuing contracts for the manufacturing of ventilators. And 3 years from now, there will still be some company out there making more ventilators than we actually need on a federal contract, even though we've already figured out that lack of ventilators was not the problem. And again, because government doesn't respond to incentives the way private sector businesses do.
Well, and you look at Benjamin Anderson. This is the economist I cited about playing God. And if you take anything away from this, say Benjamin Anderson. And I want to say something about the United States related to that and COVID. I really fell in love with Benjamin Anderson, who was like Hayek, but from America in the 1930s. His book is called Economics and the Public Welfare, and it's a little dense, but it does talk about playing God. And no American economist I knew had ever heard of this guy, even though he was so important and the Chase banker. One day, phone rings, and it was a Russian economist working in the Kremlin. And he said, Amity, but he didn't. He said, Amity, because he had a Russian accent. And he said, Amity, Anderson. And I couldn't understand what he was saying. Finally, I figured I was saying Anderson. He said, we read Anderson in the Kremlin. And America doesn't read Anderson, but it explains everything. So that goes to show you sometimes we don't know enough about ourselves. It was the same people who in the Kremlin read Hayek and tried to make Putin have a flat tax or whatever free market counseling he got. They read Anderson and Hayek to Putin as it was Andrei Illarionov, in case any of you know him. He's active in the Mount Pelerin Society and I think at Cato. And he said, I couldn't understand what he was saying. Anderson, it was, he had read all about the Great Depression and knew more about it than most tenured professors in the United States. So, okay.
That is really fascinating. And since you brought that up, I remember actually Boris Yeltsin talking about a flat tax during the time that Boris Yeltsin was in place. And I can remember thinking, there may be some merit to just blowing things up and starting over again if it gives you an opportunity to consider policies like that.
Sometimes outsiders understand the U.S. better than we do. We're
Yeah,
provincial.
yeah.
Do we, maybe he was from I don't know much about him. He died soon after World War II, Benjamin Anderson,
Hmm.
or
So,
soon after the Great Depression.
so, we're talking about the Great Depression, but of course, what we're all thinking about is the current situation. They are very different, as you pointed out. We would not argue that the government caused the Great Depression, I don't think. I think you would argue that it extended it, but didn't cause it. Whereas when you look at the current situation, I mean, government caused it, right? I mean, government ordered businesses to shut down. Government banned people from getting together and engaging in commerce. And so, from my standpoint, looking at it through a policy lens, it looked an awful lot like a takings to me, where the government literally tells businesses they cannot operate. And so, when programs like the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Act, were proposed, and when the Small Business Administrations, I think it was called the EIDL, the Economic Emergency Loan Program or whatever, when those programs were first put into place, in my view, even though I hate big government spending and I hate government bailouts, in my view, there was at least some logical justification to that, since it was the government that shut things down in the first place. I wonder what are your thoughts and what was your evaluation on those programs, on the PPP program and on the EIDL program, recognizing, of course, that anytime you have a program like that, you are opening the door to fraud, and you're opening the door to people who don't actually need money taking advantage of the program and things like that.
Well, I have the luxury of not sitting at the Fed or the Treasury, and it's so easy to kibitz from the sidelines, is it not? Rather, and not working for an administration facing an election. But my concern for the future of America is inflation and property rights. Probably property rights even more than inflation, because property is what's hurt by inflation. And the absolute disregard for the importance of property, the meaning of property, and the benefits of property during COVID and after, this week, all of a sudden with the social unrest, it's the same. What do I mean by that? A forgivable loan. What does that mean? Forgivable loan. What is that? It's a loan that you might get forgiven for. So you are going to accept a large amount of bureaucracy on the bet that you get to keep the money. That is creepy, because it undermines contract. Contract should be clear. It's a loan or it's a gift, one or the other, or the conditions are in the contract itemized. You will be forgiven thus and thus. It's not quite like that. Those forgivable loans depend on the mood, the whim of the regulator, do they not? So
that's actually a great point, because in fact, they've already modified the terms a couple of times on that program, like even in the middle of it. So there are people who took some of those funds, and then after they received the funds, the terms were changed.
That's so right. And it's so creepy. At the Coolidge Foundation, we had to decide whether to take support. We're a nonprofit, and I was told by many people we're eligible for support. Coolidge didn't like government money. We're not even a library like the Bush libraries, in the sense that we don't receive federal funding to help us with our archival and research work. So our board chose not to take the money, and I'm glad, because we don't have the staff to manage the bureaucracy of government loans. I would have to hire a person to manage that, because we're one of those small businesses, right? And many small businesses are in that situation. The second, so what you're getting at is, what does this remind you of? This reminds me of the 70s, Tom, not the 30s. That is, it's going to be a little bit of time before unemployment goes down to lows, because all the protections and sort of payments we've made make it harder to want to go back to work. Employers are paying people who aren't working out of payroll protection money, so they're not very interested in working. Working doesn't look that attractive in some parts of the country. The data suggests that many people are getting more money not working than they did working, which is a very classically dangerous situation, as was true in the United Kingdom in the 20s when the term dole became a pejorative for that reason, deterrent to work. So I think of this as more of a spongy period to come, like the 70s, with an assault on property rights, because we, even without the current, protesters saying property doesn't matter compared to lives, property rights were already under assault. And, property and lives are related. It's not an either or. When you hurt property, you hurt lives.
Right. You destroy someone's business, you destroy their livelihood, which
And
is certainly related to their life.
And just because it's not dramatic, there's an asymmetry of result. Okay, you see someone die on television, it's the most tragic thing in the world. He died in front of my eyes, right? You see someone die 5 years of alcoholism because his business failed. That's a very slow death. It's not dramatic, but it does happen. So while we can't ever condone violence, we have to respect the personal damage that came from this situation as really terrible, tragic, and even fatal to some. Coolidge said personal rights and property rights are the same thing, and I'm tending to believe that, but that's turned out to be a radical thing to say.
It is a good example, though, of the economic principle of sort of that which is seen versus that which is unseen, right? And you ran into the same thing with COVID-19, right? So what everyone's focusing on is that which is seen, which is the number of cases, the number of deaths, and all that sort of thing. But no one's looking at that which is unseen, which is the people who are almost being forced into clinical depression, suicides, long-term health problems that may take decades to play out because of that time period. But everyone's wrapped up in that which is seen, and they're totally ignoring that which is unseen. So, well, let me ask you this, because I find this fascinating. You and I both have the benefit of, as you said, being on the sideline and sort of, tossing our opinion out from the peanut gallery. But in a situation like the COVID-19 pandemic, what do you think was the proper role for the federal government? I mean, if the government forces businesses to close, I suppose one answer would be don't force businesses to close, right? But if the government thinks that there's a compelling public health reason to force businesses to close, does the government not have an obligation to those same businesses?
I think guidance would have been enough. It's very hard to watch. You watch Sweden, for example, the country that had the least onerous controls, and there were more deaths then. Were there more deaths net? We don't know. Or were there deaths in Sweden just early? I think the general policy, supposing we discerned fairly early that vulnerable people, which is to say people our age and older, Tom.
Thank you so much for that, Amity.
Yeah, vulnerable people, most of us on the call, needed special protection. And I think what I would have opted for, were I God, but I never want to play God or be God, is to take the $10,000 you give 10 people in payroll protection and give it all to the super vulnerable and let the other people work and help the vulnerable, get an extra room in their apartment, get an extra place to stay, get a different office. I would have gone that way, devote incredible resources to the vulnerable and, isolate them in the kindest way from the rest of the population, because we hurt young people when we do not allow them to work for 6 months. No question about it. We hurt young people and create drug addiction or foster drug addiction when we take them out of high school and they don't have anything to do. So we can't be, that's my view. So it's controversial, but I don't think the whole society should be hostage to the needs of this group, but I do think the group should get far more resources than it's got so far. That is, channel all the resources toward the vulnerable group.
And of course, the problem with when the government takes top-down action is it sort of precludes any sort of bottom-up.
Tocqueville's being crucified over and over again, or he's rolling over in his grave, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So
he made Tocqueville roll over in his grave.
So you have the governor of New York.
I'm trying to decide whether to write a book on Tocqueville. And it's just a guy rolling over in his I mean, the America that we know is the strong America is completely disregarded by this process this year.
Yeah, and you again, you do feel like, okay, so it's true that we don't know what we're up against in the early days, right?
Right.
But then the question becomes, are we more likely to figure it out quicker with people making real-time decisions from the bottom up, or are we more likely to figure out what's going on with decrees being given to us from the top down by government bureaucrats?
I know. Well, you know, the happiest point, let's get to the question, so I feel like I'm talking too much, but the happiest point for me was I read a University of Chicago study that came out in the middle, and they said, we found this alternate way to treat certain subset of COVID cases. We have hyperbaric chambers and oxygen masks, or something with oxygen but less pressure than a ventilator. And guess what? Our patients all lived. And I thought, thank goodness someone is innovating. He might be wrong, but at least he's trying.
Yeah.
Looks like a pretty solid study, you know. And I'm not an epidemiologist. How would I know? But there was a kind of Stalinism to the initial approach. And I'm from New York. I raised my children in New York. I love New York. I think it's one of the most wonderful places ever in the history of man. And so I will say to Texas, some of New York's troubles had to do with the fact that it was the very dense place and the first place. So it was at the bottom of the learning curve. So I spend a lot of time with my Republican friends, especially defending New York, even if
I'm sorry. In New York, you have Republican friends? Is that are you saying you have Republican friends in New York?
No. I mean, Jan, what I'm saying is New York was there first, and they had no idea what to do because it was the first city after Seattle. And some of the other states did have a little bit of benefit of observing what damage density could do in New York. And now I'm making some enemies, so we better move on.
Well, I've never been more grateful to live 35 miles from a major metropolitan city center as I have for the past couple of months, I have to say. Amity, I want to ask you a question about your new book about the Great Society. But before I do that, let me again invite folks, if you have questions that you would like to ask, down at your bottom menu bar at the bottom of your Zoom window, you have the ability to raise your hand. And I would encourage you to go ahead and do that so that you get in the queue. We don't want people to have Zoom fatigue, so we try to keep these events from just going on and on. We try to keep them short. We try to be disciplined about time. So I would urge you now to get your question in the queue because there may be a limited number. Okay, I see 2 or 3 popping up already. That's good. There may be a limited number of those that we can get to. Amity, tell us a little bit. You and I talked yesterday in preparation about your new book about the Great Society, and you said that you thought it was your best. So tell us a little bit about your book. As I mentioned, I've already grabbed the Kindle version of it. I'm sure a lot of folks here would love to read it. So could you tell us a little bit about that for just a few minutes?
Very briefly, Great Society is it's a new history of the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. You can raise your hand like this and we'll flip through and see if you're raising your hand too, guys, because I feel like we're letting some of you down. But Great Society is the history of the 1960s. I include Kennedy and Nixon, who expanded Johnson's Great Society. And I thought it was my best because I focused on the competition between the public and the private sector. Everyone wanted a great society. The only question was, how do you get it? Through the public sector or the private sector. We opted for the public sector. We said the government's going to take us from good to great. The private sector was pretty darn impressive, and much of the greatness we got for America in the 60s and subsequent came from the private sector. So I kind of have 2 dueling forces, and I'm proud that I was able to study companies. 3 companies in the book are GE, which is an old-fashioned company, Fairchild, which became Intel, of course, or at least some of it, and Toyota, the Challenger. So to the auto industry and the auto union specifically. So that was the first time I've been able to really cover business in the way I liked. And I hope you guys take a look at that book. I'm going on the Bohannon show, the radio show tonight, and a couple other radio shows, because a lot of Great Society is about the riots. Oh, there's something very interesting about There's a long portrait of John Connally, if any of you knew him.
That's part of what I'm eager to dig into, because I think a lot of folks have, especially a lot of folks here in Texas, have almost sort of forgotten how influential and important John Connally was and what a player he was, going all the way back there, all the way up through his campaign for president against Ronald Reagan for the Republican nomination. Amity, you made a reference a little earlier about that some folks have taken issue with some things you've said. For the left, their narrative about the Great Depression, I mean, their New Deal narrative and their Great Society narratives are their great heroic stories, right? I mean, this is the myth making for the left, that it was big government and it was government programs and government agencies that got us out of the Great Depression, and it was big government through the Great Society that tackled poverty and that made us a more socially just society. So if you're going to go back and challenge those narratives, you're challenging the hero stories for the left.
That's right. But, hope is not a policy. Hope is not a result, more important. So because something's inspiring, the only thing to fear is fear itself, or it doesn't mean it's a good policy. What all it is all hope is, when an executive summons people with hope, is the executive hoping for license to do whatever policy occurs to him, really, often. The part with John Connally is hilarious, because I will say some things about John Connally at the risk of offending some of you who may have known him better. John Connally was a bully. He was a bright man who did a lot. He helped in education in Texas mightily as governor. And he was amusing and inspiring and scary at many points. He tangled with the Office of Economic Opportunity, which was the poverty office of Washington in the Great Society, built to stop riots, like the kind of institution we're about to build today. The poverty office had a lot of kind of progressive programs, and one of them involved higher wages in Texas. And Connally, as governor, said basically, we in Texas can't pay wages that high. We'll lose business. This was after Taft-Hartley. One of our advantages is our wages are lower. And Washington could not believe that a governor wouldn't advocate for higher wages in his state. What is that? But Connally was absolutely right. I believe he vetoed one of the Great Society programs. Governors had that right. He offended the authorities in Washington as a, I guess, conservative Democrat, and he wasn't afraid to. He told Johnson's team that he thought Johnson's make-work projects, because there are plenty of make-work projects in the Great Society, as in the New Deal, were just a boondog. That was the phrase he used. He didn't say boondoggle. He said boondog, which a term I never heard, but sounded good to me. Boondog, by which we all know exactly what he meant, which is to say a make-work project, not one that adds value to the U.S. economy. So that was funny. And then when it's curious, right? I mean, here he was, first of all, he had a halo, having been wounded when President Kennedy was killed. So hard to criticize him. And very attractive as a political candidate. And Richard Nixon made him Treasury Secretary. I didn't remember this, in the hopes that they would have a fusion ticket, Nixon-Connally, in '72. Nixon was a very political animal, and he thought that'd be awesome to have a fusion ticket and he could win and end the war in Vietnam or whatever. But in order to prove to Connally his goodwill and his willingness to give Connally authority, he put Connally as Treasury Secretary in charge of the U.S. economy. And it was Connally who kind of wrote the stage plan for the 1971 Camp David new economic plan, or economic shock as it was called. The Nixon shock is what the Japanese call it. So they came down, and as many of you know, in August 1971 with a new economic plan to get the economy going in time for the election in 1972. And it was one of the world's worst plans because it was so economically redundant, inconsistent, and awful. That was the wage and price controls, the simultaneous severing of the gold exchange standard, new tariffs, and also internal supports for automakers through subsidies for car purchases, and you may know more. But it was just a bunch of stuff written to appeal to voters that even contradicted it itself or was redundant. And in the book, I write about the policies, of course, and how poor they were, and how they, so I suggest they would give us the 70s, which they did, that economic purgatory. But also I spend a lot of energy detailing how John Connally tortured Arthur Burns, the Fed chairman, which he did with Nixon's gleeful acquiescence. So if you, I mean, history is about people too. And Arthur Burns, the Fed chairman, probably didn't want to go along with ending the gold standard, but he went along because John Connally terrified him into it. And that's an amusing story, albeit a tragic one in outcome.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so if you are looking around trying to figure out how to raise your hand, you click on participants down at the bottom of your screen, and then it's in the participants menu is where you have the ability to raise your hand. Our first question is going to come from Bill, and our second question is going to come from Lynn. So, but we'll first go to Bill. Bill, please ask your question.
Okay. There's a book called Raw Deal or New Deal. And in the book, they make the point that Roosevelt really failed at everything he tried except politics. They named a number of things. Once he failed as a banker, failed as other things. And my question is, you know, your comments on that point and how it relates to the fact that now we have a president that has been successful in business, you know, beyond belief, and has the acumen to get us through this, and how it compares this time to back in the Depression.
Well, like John Connally, Franklin Roosevelt was a political animal. I don't even think you need to take down the person or build him up. I tend to go for the policy. Franklin Roosevelt's economic policies were awful. That's because he didn't really care about economics or business. It just wasn't in his nature. He was a pretty good sailor, and he was a Navy president. So there were things he did in World War II many of us could support. But he was a better commander-in-chief than he was president. So yes, you're speaking of the Bert Folsom book, I think. There's also a good book by Jim Powell. I really give Roosevelt terrible marks for the most important job he had in the Great Depression, which was getting us out of the Great Depression. But I think you know, what I try to do is not ever assail people and just look at the policy. Roosevelt was just unwilling to be aware of how economies work.
Okay, Lynn, you're up. You're unmuted, so please ask your question.
Okay, thank you for taking my question. Why is it that economists still look at the unemployment rate when in fact that's not really an accurate description of the unemployed? Since in fact there's a lot of shadow unemployment when people fall off the unemployment rolls after not getting a job after 18 or 24 months, they still don't have a job, but they are unemployed. My question is, don't you think it's more accurate to follow wage growth? Because wage growth would actually show you that we do have a squeeze in the employment numbers.
Well, I think we should, you know why economists focus on a better number. It's because they want to please the politicians they work for or the companies, right? So they'll always look among, you know, what is it? U6, U1, right? And look the one that suits their government. Not all economists who work for the government are creeps, but there's enormous pressure on them to supply the number that their administration seeks, of course. So they'll go among the numbers and pick the one. And I do care about labor. I care about productivity too. So you want to look, are people getting a higher real wage? What's getting in the way of that wage? Sometimes it's taxes, you know, take home. Sometimes it's productivity. So I agree with you. There's a kind of tyranny of the unemployment data right now, and often the wrong number is the holy number.
Okay, thank you, Lynn. Our next question is from George Pond. George, you are unmuted, so go ahead, please.
Thank you, Tom. Looking forward to the election, what would be your projection of how the unemployment rate will become better?
Oh gosh, well, personally, I think that's why I mentioned the 70s. I think it's going to be a long time before we get back to the level we had, the astoundingly low level, if you look at one number, just a few months ago, because the attractions of work are not that great, and because the recovery of companies is not going to come as we imagine. I mean, I think the sort of tragedy of the year that has yet to be written after COVID and riots and sorrow is the death of retail, death of shop retail. Because with the blow of the challenge of online, then the challenge of COVID, then now getting their windows broken, a lot of those retailers will never rehire as they did in patterns they did. So I'm concerned that unemployment will be 70s-ish for quite a long time before and after the election.
Amity, as someone who came of age in the 70s, that's a very discouraging thing to hear. I hope you're wrong about that. The 70s were not a good time. Our next question is from Carl. Carl, you are unmuted, so go ahead, please.
Well, I'm going to play off of something you said, Tom, that the damage that has been done was a government taking. I would go a little further. This is the first known media-caused pandemic. We didn't have actually a pandemic. We didn't have any reason to do anything except that 90% of the press was hyping raw terror, fear. You're going to die immediately. And I'm curious to have Amity's thoughts about how we can reasonably and responsibly push back against what I consider a gang of criminals.
Well, thank you, Carl. I mean, I think both in the current troubles in the cities, and then all, and also the COVID, the best has become the perfect, has become the enemy of the good. So the government made a tremendous error when it said it would keep Americans safe. Americans are never safe. They're just in a risky or a less risky situation, right? Even in your own room with the door barred, you could fall down and break your head. So this idea that we can ever be safe is a false idea that we cannot advertise. It's just, life is trade-offs. There was an interesting article by Eddie Lampert about comparing COVID to auto safety. Autos are never safe. They're just less safe. They're just less risky or more risky, right? And as a country, we reduce the riskiness of autos over time by better construction, maybe by rules. But this idea that we could be safe and that government could make us safe if we followed enough rules, that was one of the worst things ever perpetrated upon the American people, to try to convince them that if they were good, we would be safe. And it's sort of the same with the deaths in the cities. Nobody ever wants anyone to die in a police incident. No one. We want fewer such deaths. But if we say we will never again have such a death, which is really what Black Lives Matters wants, we are deluding ourselves. We can never get to perfect. We can only get to better or good. So that's why my book's called Great Society. It's ironic, right? Because we aim for great, we didn't get even good. So that's my concern. The assumption is that government can save us. That's what COVID, the federal behavior under COVID has been. Government knows the answer, and to teach people that is to do them such a huge disservice.
Amity, your comments touch on one of my sort of pet issues, is that it's the primary job of government is not to keep us safe, it's to keep us free. And, anytime we get those in the wrong order, we ending up with wrong policy conclusions. But I do think most people think government's first job is to keep us safe. I think people look to the government to keep us safe. And that's sort of the original sin in this whole area. I have two remaining questions, and so there is time for a couple of more if people are inclined to ask questions. Our next question is from Llewellyn Bassano, and then after that will be Joe Barnett. And Joe, you need to unmute your microphone in order to ask your question, but we'll go with Llewellyn first. So Llewellyn, go ahead, please.
Hi, Amity. I love your work.
Oh, thank you.
So when does hyperinflation kick in the U.S.?
I don't know, but because I care about Germany and have spent some time on it, I'm always concerned about high inflation. So I think the monetary crisis will come when the currency is challenged. And if we'd been here 30 years ago, we would have said the dollar can never be challenged. It's so deep. It's sovereign currency. It's a currency of reserve. We have, and so on. No one could ever make a currency except a government. We know very well now that a company and a commodity could get together, and maybe with a government, maybe not, and make a currency that could challenge the dollar. What is the Bitcoin but the expression of distrust in the dollar? So I think the currency will be challenged, and then the interest rates will go up, whether or not we call the devaluation of our currency that attends the rise of the new currency hyperinflation.
It is interesting, Amity, isn't it, that many of us have been watching the actions of government over the last decade or so and have been thinking, this has to inevitably lead to inflation. And it's like one of the great mysteries that it hasn't yet, right? I mean, I think mortgage rates are actually at historic lows right now.
Llewellyn, I have egg all over my face, and I've done consulting with any number of companies where I warned about inflation, and they called me 2 years later and said, "You were wrong. Give us back your check." No, they didn't. but I've been wrong about this. But mainly maybe because of my interest in Germany, I can't give it up.
Could you not make the case that the inflation is in financial assets?
You could make the case that the inflation is in financial assets. Yes. I agree. I'm scared of the financial assets personally, but I am the world's, ask my son, who is a graduate of the University of Texas, and the world's worst financial advisor.
Thank you, Llewellyn. Next question is from Joe Barnett. Joe, go ahead, please. Joe, you are unmuted, so you're up. It's your turn.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Hi, Amity.
Hi.
You just touched on a subject that I found of particular interest in your book on the Depression, which was in that situation as now. Okay, FDR at one point was complaining about banks holding capital and proposed a capital tax to force them to lend money. And that's been discussed. That idea has actually been floated again here in the current situation, as well as, and in monetary terms, I gather it's equivalent to negative interest rates. Okay, in other words, a number of European countries have imposed taxes on bank deposits to force people to invest that money. And a number of countries, particularly Japan, going on, 20 years now, have had zero or negative interest rates. And so I'd like you to address those two things. And the third thing, getting back to where's the inflation gone, my assumption has been that we have exported our inflation to other countries. And as long as capital is flowing here, which it will always do, because this is the safe haven for capital, relatively speaking, that they are the ones that are going to, be suffering the effects of the inflation. But so if you could address zero and low interest rates and the idea of a capital tax, thinking that that idea is equivalent to zero or negative interest rates.
Well, I'm not educated enough or knowledgeable enough about banking to answer this. But what is clear is that since 2008, and we haven't talked about 2008, but it's a big factor, playing with the government has been more important to many banks than playing with commercial borrowers, say, because of a variety of reasons, which you're very familiar with. So when the federal government pays interest on reserves, when the federal government, whatever. So that makes for disinvestment, illogical investment, and illogical growth that's suboptimal. Therefore, our growth is less good than we think it is. That relates to Llewellyn. You know, the equity prices are higher than what the companies are worth. Same thing. So all these distortions are the result of too much playing with the government. That's all I can say. And I am, you know, my whole career has been about explaining complicated things to people who normally don't think about econ. And that's very easy to do right now because there's so many examples. Here's an example I would give. There's a driving school where I am that was shut down. And it's laying off people because it lost revenue. But I won't say where I am, but we called the driving school and we said, we have a teenager who needs driving lessons. And the driving school said, we can't take you because we have a contract with the high schools, with the government, to teach 100 public school kids to drive. And we're waiting for the money on that contract. And we're waiting for those kids. So it'll be at least half a year before we can get to private clients. We, as a private client, might pay 50% more than the contract that per kid the state did for its high school students. But our little profit, our little extra rent we were giving could not offset the scale of the clientele of the government. They're not interested in us. They're interested in their one big mega client, the state, right? And all the counties and the schools. Therefore, the individual client and the individual market opportunity is lost. That's the best way I can think of explaining how our market is right now. Decisions are not being made for profit, at least not one-on-one. They're kind of being made by deal. In the longer run, the driving school needs people like us, but they're so distracted by the big government client and maybe the payroll protection and the forgivable loan. We, the regular client, are not in the picture. And that's very Soviet. If you've ever been to a Soviet restaurant in the day, you go and it's empty and you say, oh, it's empty. May I sit down? They say, no, the room is reserved for a tour group, right? So you can't eat here. That is the small consumer and the obvious economic choices shut out.
Amity, we have one more question. It looks like Carl has a repeat question. So,
I may not know the answer, Carl.
So Carl, go right ahead, please, and you'll be our last question.
Well, you've just touched on something that I find deeply disturbing, the sheer bigness of everything. We have giant universities, we have giant corporations, we have giant retailers, we have giant government, we have, and the very fact that what Amity just touched on, which is that because there's this one big client, which happens to be the government, nobody gives a damn about the individual consumer. And this touches on a whole bunch of aspects of our life, but I have keeps rattling around in my head, bigness is a problem, and we have not really thought about it or addressed it.
There was a wonderful book. Oh my gosh, I believe it was by Louis Brandeis, am I right? Called The Curse of Bigness.
Yes.
Now Louis Brandeis came at it from a left antitrust perspective, right? As far as I recall. This was a long time ago, a century ago. The Curse of Bigness. It's a great title. The curse of bigness, in his case, he believed it was private sector bigness, What you're alluding to is bigness that exists because of government contract or regulation. And I'm with you. Bigness that comes about totally privately, I'm not so concerned about, because when a company gets big enough to prosecute it for antitrust reasons, it's usually about ready to collapse anyhow, because it's being competed with by some innovator. But the bigness that is the bigness of a government rent seeker, a government partner, is much harder to undo, and therefore more threatening, more pernicious. And right now we have an awful lot of government partners in our economy. So I agree with you.
Well, the only thing is that we talked earlier about the fact that many retailers are not going to come back. But a lot of that has to do with what is called the Amazon effect. And the Amazon is a private sector company. Now, they lobby very skillfully to preserve their privileges and their special carve-outs. But it seems to me that bigness goes beyond just government.
I'm less of what I'm afraid of. I mean, with the retailers, they're challenged by Amazon, yes. Now they're going to have to double their insurance premium.
Yes.
That's a social policy caused cost. They have a minimum wage in many states because it's supposed to be fair to the worker. That's a cause we wouldn't, that's a blow they shouldn't have to absorb. We have arbitrary regulations in situations like COVID. That's a blow. So I'm concerned about the little retailer for sure, but I would argue that a lot of the blows to the little retailer are unnecessary. I mean, Amazon may one day, fall down of its own accord. That's what happened with past giants. Nobody thought the railroad would ever go down.
Amity, the liability
100 years
situation.
ago.
The
What?
liability situation is a real concern because there are employers right now who are concerned if they bring their employees back and they get sick, they're going to get sued. And there's been some talk in DC about some sort of a limited liability shield or something like that. But what do you think about that?
Well, personally, I think that's great. I know you've had some legal reform in Texas. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. We have probably the country's best tort reform here in Texas.
And that tort reform improved business conditions?
Dramatically, especially in the medical profession. You had doctors moving here from other states because their liability insurance was 1/3 the cost that it was in other states and things like that.
Well, I see a little doggy, Jill Hilbert. That's great. I have a question for you, which is, what is the best way to educate young people? I had the honor to learn this week that Texas A&M made my new book a textbook.
Oh, wonderful.
Acquired a few of them, so I'm lucky. But what can we do for high schoolers and middle schoolers, because they have never learned that property or contract is important unless their family is in business?
Well, look, I think you did something really sort of interesting and experimental in this area by doing a graphic version of one of your books.
Yeah, here it is.
I think an awful lot of young people are not going to sit down and read a 250 or 300 page book on economics, but if it's a story that's different. And so I thought that's what was really sort of unique about doing a graphic version of your book. So, I mean, you tell me, did you have great anecdotes and stories about the way that the graphic version of your book was more accessible than maybe just the text-only version?
Well, the graphic book, I will say, I really care about our grandchildren. So I spent $250,000 on this book. Not all my money, but it was spent. Let's just put it that way. In order to make a cartoon history of the 1930s, a few years ago. So you can see all the pages. There are 1,800 images in there. There's monetary and everything. I thought it was awesome. I thought the artist was awesome. I can say it's awesome since mostly I didn't do it. The artist did it. He was great. His name is Paul Revoche. I still work with him. It was a bestseller. It was #1 bestseller in graphic, what this category is called graphic novel, which is, it's like a comic, but it's more serious. And there have been a few breakthrough books in this category. But I will say most conservatives found disapproved of this book because they thought that I was talking baby talk to them, which is not at all. I was just trying to reach out to younger people through cartoons. So I wouldn't say the book was a bestseller, even though it did hit the ~1 for a week or two. So I like this format, but I wouldn't say it's broken through yet. At least not for econ. There was one about the Iranian Revolution called Persepolis that did break through, and millions of kids learned about the tyranny of the Iranian Revolution through that cartoon book. But I continue to believe in movies, TV, cartoons. Keynes v. Hayek was a big success, and I could take suggestions because I think we are really going to have a challenge educating middle schoolers and high schoolers.
Well, you know, we could do a whole nother hour Zoom on the whole issue of culture preceding politics, but we probably shouldn't take that on right now. I want to ask you one last question, and that is on some of the immediate sort of civil unrest that we're seeing going on right now in the country. You touched on that a little bit about some of that going on in the 60s and probably even during the Depression and New Deal era. Do you have any thoughts on what government can do? It certainly seems to me that riots end up occupying the space that would rightfully be held by peaceful protesters. And it certainly seems that you've got to clear away violent riots in order to create space for peaceful protests. But I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think, you know, I'm going to go on the radio for a whole hour about this tonight, and I hope I don't say something that I'm not quite pleased with. But what I think is, there was a phrase called the long march through the institutions. Mao had a long march, right? He marched a march, and eventually he ruled China through communism. And the European socialists said, we're not going to win on the battlefield, but we as socialists and social democrats will win by conducting a slow, long march through the institutions. And soon, eventually, we will be the top teachers and we will train our country. In the 60s, we had revolutionaries, self-proclaimed, and they didn't prevail. Richard Nixon won. But they did undertake a long march through NPR, through the institutions, right? And the reason this happened is that our schools taught kids that property rights don't matter, that America is racist when it largely isn't, or at least is less racist than it was in the past, that all police are bad when only some police are bad, a minority, that only blacks are victims of police violence, when that, of course, is not the case either. So there's very little data out there to go along with the narrative. And who permitted that argument? Teachers, curricula, parents, but teachers. So in the 60s, when you saw the marches, there were more genuinely poor people at that time, I will say, in the North, particularly. And it was more, now you get the feeling, looking at the protesters, that they're genuinely angry people. In the 60s, you could say, well, if these people became homeowners, they would act differently. Homeowners are not home burners, what was said in the 60s by Father Kohler in St. Louis. Homeowners are not home burners. People who own property won't riot. Now you get the impression, and this is just anecdotal, but you get the impression that the people who are causing the trouble are the children of homeowners or the nephews, right? So I would then say a lot of this is about our own failure to educate Americans about where the value is and where the hope is.
That's terrific, Amity. Thanks so much. I'm going to call next upon Addie Crimmins. Addie is with us here at IPI. So we've got another event coming up a week from today, next Thursday. So let me recognize Addie. Addie, you're unmuted, so go ahead, please.
Amity, hi. I just had a quick comment about reaching younger people, and I'm in my early 30s, so I'm not quite the audience, but I listened to you on the Ben Shapiro show a couple of weeks ago, And so did a ton of my friends. And I just think that there's something to different platforms to digest information and different ways that especially because we can't do many things in person, that we're finding ways to reach information. And I just think from that one podcast to talking about it with friends, sending it to people, I mean, we're able to get information and figure out people like you who are such a wealth of information in different ways on different platforms. So I just wanted to share that I love you on
really
Virtue
use
Hero.
some
And
advice. Thank you, Addie. I'd like to give a plug to the Coolidge Foundation, where that's all we do. We have high school economic debate, which we started in Texas with Texas teachers. So we give kids briefs for both sides, and they argue the abolition of the capital gains tax and very controversial and free market arguments or Marxist arguments are tried out by them. And we also have a scholarship program for children, and they learn all about Calvin Coolidge, who saved money and was always civil and didn't believe in violence, and who cut taxes. So we concentrate almost entirely on youth at the Coolidge Foundation, and we hope to work with your foundation.
Amity,
Thank
that's
you.
really terrific. We so much appreciate you being with us today. We love you and we love your work, and you've made a wonderful contribution as a researcher and a historian. So thanks so much. And we look forward to getting you down to Dallas sometime soon.
In real life. Thank you.
When we're able to do those things again. I want to thank everybody who joined us today. I want to thank those who made additional donations. That was very kind, and we appreciate it so much. And as I mentioned, we're doing a program next week, next Thursday, on how government fairness regulations destroyed conservative talk radio back in the 50s and 60s. And are we about to do the same thing on the internet? So you can find out more information about that on our website at ipi.org, and you can register for that event as well. So in the meantime, I will thank Amity again, and I will wish you all health and safety. And we look forward to seeing you all again as soon as possible. Thanks so much, and have a good rest of your day.